as humans, we're a pretty diverse bunch. We speak different languages, eat different food, and have different opinions on some pretty important topics like which way the toilet roll goes on. I mean, does the paper go over the top or underneath? But one thing that we do all have in common, regardless of color, sex, or age, is skin. Now, I think we can all agree that skin is pretty important. It acts as a physical barrier from bacteria. It helps keep us hydrated, and it also helps monitor our body temperature. And without skin, well, your insides would be on the outside. And it's also used in a method of bookbinding known as Anthropodermic Bibliopegy. You wouldn't believe how many takes it took me to spit that term out correctly. Now, why would anyone in their right or wrong mind want to bind a book in human flesh? I mean, maybe it was because they wanted a special keepsake, or they wanted to increase the collectability. Because let's face it, we all have kind of a morbid fascination with all things ghastly and gruesome. Or maybe it's just because you're a creepy-ass doctor with no morals or respect for your patients. And that's exactly what some of these books are. Now, if you're watching this video, you probably are familiar with the recent controversy over at the Houghton Library at Harvard University surrounding the book, The Destinies of the Soul. Now, this is a book that was written by French writer Arsène Houssaye and was given to his friend, a doctor by the name of Ludovic Bouland. Now, Bouland took the book down to his local bookbinder, and he also gave them the material that he wanted the book bound in. But that material turned out to be, well, human flesh. And where Bouland got it? Well, he actually tells us.
A book about the human soul deserved to have a human covering. I had kept this skin taken from the back of a woman.
Now, Bouland's use of the word deserved is interesting because apparently, because of the topic of the book, Bouland decided that the book deserved to have more respect than the woman he took it from. And perhaps instead of writing taken from the back of a woman, he should have written stolen from the back of a woman, because it's almost certain that she did not give him her consent. Now, the only thing we do know about this woman is that she was a patient at an asylum and that she died after complications from a stroke. Now, this book has been in the Harvard University Library's collection since the 1930s, but since the filming of this video, that book has been removed and the binding has been taken off. And Harvard is attempting to try to find this woman's identity so that they can respectfully deal with her remains. However, this isn't the only book that Bouland had in his collection. The Wellcome Library in London has a book that was also bound by Bouland. And this book happens to be about female virginity. And like the book at the Houghton Library, the Wellcome edition also has Bouland's description of, well, what the book was bound in.
Bound with a piece of female skin, tanned by myself with sumac.
Now, I don't know about you, but it seems to me that Dr. Bouland had some issues with women. Now, the books at the Houghton Library and the Wellcome Library are both fully bound in leather. And in some anthropodermic books, they're bound in quarter leather, like this book here. But I'm pretty sure that this book isn't covered in human skin. Yeah, pretty sure. But there are 3 at the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia that are. Now, these books were the work of John Stockton Hoff, a young physician who was working at the Philadelphia General Hospital in the latter part of the 19th century. And in 1868, a young penniless widow named Mary Lynch was admitted to the hospital, which was then called Old Blocky. And Mary was suffering from tuberculosis. Now, during her stay, her family was bringing in food to help supplement her hospital diet, but unbeknownst to them or anybody else, the food was contaminated with a parasitic worm, and Mary contracted trichinosis. And well, the combination of tuberculosis and trichinosis was pretty much what killed her. Now, Hoff, who was studying trichinosis, decided to do the autopsy on Mary, and while he was there, also decided to help himself from some flesh off her thigh. And he also decided to keep this flesh in the basement in a chamber pot filled with... Now, soaking leather or hide in urine was a pretty common practice in the tanning method because the urine helped break down some of the fat and the hair and made the hide a little bit easier to work with when binding books. And Dr. Hoff also left us a description of, well, how he did it. Now, to be fair, creepy doctors weren't the only ones who were engaging in this practice. The city of Cincinnati has 2 volumes of Phyllis Wheatley's poems that are covered in human skin. One is fully bound, one is half bound. And the origins of the skin are unknown. Now, Phyllis Wheatley was the first African-American female poet to get some recognition. And her fan base included the likes of Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. But she still couldn't get her book published here in America. So in 1773, Phyllis went to London, where she did get her book published. And while she was there, she was presented with a copy of John Milton's Paradise Lost. And sadly, several years later, either Phyllis or her husband, after her death, had to sell that book in order to pay off some debts. And that book, I believe, is actually at the Houghton Library at Harvard University. But speaking of John Milton, well, there's a book in the UK known as the Cudmore Milton. And that book is covered in the flesh of a man named George Cudmore, who in 1830 murdered his wife. Now, Cudmore was executed, and his skin was saved to bind a copy of Milton's poetical works in 1853. Where the skin was kept between 1830 and 1853, that remains a mystery. And there's also a book at the Boston Athenaeum, which contains the skin of one James Allen, alias George Walton, a highwayman. And Allen decided that he wanted them to keep some of his skin after he died in order to bind 2 copies of his memoirs. And in Bristol, England, there's a book bound in the skin of one John Horton, a jilted lover with some anger issues, who's accused of murdering his former girlfriend, Eliza Balsam, in 1821. Now, John really didn't accept that Eliza had rejected him and saw her out walking one day and decided to chuck a rock at her. And it hit her in the temple. And Eliza went home that night feeling a little queasy, and over the next couple of days she decided that it was probably a good idea to go and see someone about it. And she went and saw a surgeon named Richard Smith, who decided it was a good idea to drill a hole in her head, a procedure known as trepanning, which resulted more often in the death of the patient than anything else. And that was the case with Eliza. And afterwards, Horwood was convicted of the murder. And after his execution, his body was given to Richard Smith, who did a public dissection, and afterwards used the skin to bound not only his notes, but notes from the case itself. And that's not the only thing he kept. He also decided to keep Eliza's skull for his museum. So here we have another case of a creepy-ass doctor doing some pretty unethical shit. Now, I've only seen one example of an anthropodermic book, and that was at the Hall of Surgeons in Edinburgh, where they have the skin of William Burke, the notorious murderer who was the other half of the duo Burke and Hare that terrorized Edinburgh in 1828 by murdering people and selling their bodies off to the anatomist Robert Knox, who used them in his anatomy school. Now, after Burke's execution, well, his body was given to Alexander Monro, an anatomist. And after Monro was done dissecting him, they saved some of the skin and created a notebook out of it. Now, of course, you can't touch the original, but if you want to go to the gift shop and get yourself a copy, you can. But, you know, that's just if you're, well, into that sort of thing. So how many anthropodermic books are actually out there? Well, as of now, there are 18 that have been confirmed as being bound in human skin. But I suspect there's probably a few more that are hidden away in private or institutional libraries who either don't know what they have or don't want the public to know what they have. Now, this video has only scratched the surface of these stories, and I would highly encourage you to go and read up on them because they are fascinating, and I'm going to put links below so you can do exactly that. And if you want to know more about the history behind Anthropodermic Bibliopegy, I would highly recommend Megan Rosenblum's excellent book, Dark Archives. Rosenblum has done meticulous research on the subject, and it is equally fascinating and disturbing at the same time. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and also subscribing, because there'll be more coming soon. And I'll see you next time on History by the Book. Bye-bye. Anthropodermic Bibliopegy.